Okay, we are back and we are talking about psychology. So, if you are interested in psychology and you know anything about psychology or our good friend Sigmund Freud, some of this might be familiar, but it's important to just kind of dive into this. So, psychology is complex. We're going to talk about some things, but I'll be completely honest with you. There's no physically human way that we can talk about all the things we need to psychologically. In a criminal justice class, you would need to take a psychology class or an elective. So, we're just going to touch on some of the big things from the textbook. Because I mentioned Freud, Psycho, dynamic. I can write dynamic in my sleep because I played a lot of Pokemon and there's a move called Dynamic Punch. That's terrible. Okay. So, psychodynamic theory, in a nutshell, is that an individual has three parts. This is Sigmund Freud's big thing, other than, the Oedipus complex, you wanting to murder your father and marry your mother if you're a boy. Anyway, it breaks down to your you have a constant struggle within you, a psychodynamic breakdown where you have three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is your base instincts. This is what you need to survive. The ego is as self evident as possible, it's for you. And the superego tends to be connected to this sense of justice, this sense of worth, and things like that. It tends to be some kind of reinforcement from higher up. But the idea here, as far as the psychological aspect of delinquency, is that your id tends to take over a little bit more. This base instinct that, going back to the previous thing, you have this desire for the positive pleasure of stealing, or the ego part of who you are. It's because you enjoy doing it. In the world, you have an idea of what you actually want to do. You make that conscious decision if we go by choice theory rather than biological theory. So tends not to be this one, but for sure the id. And then the superego, because it's connected to some kind of authority figure and things like that, this tends to be what's in conflict with our base instinct. Anyway, that's a very brief overview of this idea and this concept in criminal justice. Takeaway: so long and short, id wants to do crime, ego and superego say no. Delinquent follows the id. That's the 20-second breakdown of what is essentially a larger, like 30 to 45-minute dissertation on the psychodynamic theory of delinquency. Anyway, according to this as well, because of this inability to be listening to the ego or superego, anyone who has any kind of we would use mental health issue, but things like neurotics, people who are fiercely stuck in their own obsessions and things like that, these individuals are at a greater risk of falling to the id. They also bring up, and I want to talk about this as well. These two disorders are almost always misrepresented in media, much like we talked about in Intro to Criminal Justice. A lot of what television and Hollywood shows as crime work is not crime work. A lot of psychology and mental health that does bipolar and multiple personalities doesn't quite do it right. They tend to go a little bit too far. This one has no bearing on the criminal justice. It does, but not here. But when we talk about bipolar disorders, there is bipolar has been reclassified, but what it boils down to is the extremes of mania and depression. Mania does not mean you're insane or anything. It just means you experience extreme highs and extreme lows. That's why I say bipolar is very misrepresented in Hollywood as well as multiple personalities, which is why I bring it up here. Anyway, regardless of any of these things, the idea is that if you have some kind of mental disorder, you're more likely to listen to the id than to listen to the ego or superego. And so something else, but this time we have a different psychologist, Eric Erickson, comes up with something that I'm sure you've heard of. And this is the concept of an identity crisis. And so, identity crisis essentially is just there is a clash between what you understand is real and what you learn is real. The idea is that when you're uncertain of your role and purpose in life, where what you once knew was true is no longer true, you have this clash, you have this problem of who you are. The popular term, the midlife crisis, is when, a man hits his midway of his life point and he goes, oh my God, what am I doing? And he buys a sports car, dyes his hair, and things like that. It's because they're having an identity crisis. What they thought was as fact for so long is no longer fact. How do we deal with this? And in relation to the concept of delinquency in criminal justice system, if you're having an identity crisis, what is true? Are you a criminal? This is a real aspect of the psychology side. If we tell a kid that they are no good and they're just going to become a criminal, do they really believe that? Are they going to believe that the only thing they can be is a criminal, or do they believe they can be something else? There's a lot of potential work and theories with the mental impact that adults have on children in their development, and the identity crisis is just part of that. That's a key moment in development where they are not sure, and they look to others for that kind of guidance. And when they don't find that guidance, that leads to things like depression and whatnot. Anyway, obviously, I can talk a lot about mental disorders and all this stuff, but the whole whole big takeaway, because there's a lot more. We talk about behavioral theory. I'm just going to write that quickly. Behavioral theory comes from B.F. Skinner. If you're interested in some of these people, take a psychology class with us. You'll learn some of these names. John B. Watson. These individuals believe that behavioral theory is, to use a terrible phrase, monkey see, monkey do. The concept is behavioralism. It's measurable. We can see, we do this kind of modeling behavior. And this is, we learn by observing responses and behaviors. And of course, then there's an offset of this. Social learning theory. And this is by Albert Bandura. Sorry, I want to make sure I wrote his name out before I talked. So the big name is Albert Bandura. There's other people that are connected to this, and if you're into psychology, you'll know these names as well. But Walter Mischel and Richard Walters. And so for social learning theory, in particular, it's taking this modeling behavior and it's going one step further. The idea is that through social learning theory, that a child or an adolescent learns that modeling behavior through the parental model. So they learn how to be the way they are or what kind of behaviors they're going to engage in based off of what their parents do and how their parents act. So, yeah, monkey see, monkey do, but does parent do? And if the parent does, social learning theory says that, they learned through their social interactions with their family, with their parents, the people they look up to, even if it's guardians, that the adult in their life is modeling the behavior that they're going to do. So that's why social learning theory is an offset of that, but it's separate enough that it's important to note. We also talk about cognitive theory. So there's a lot of this, and I apologize. Like I said, this lecture overall is going to be very heavy philosophy and psychology. So apologies on that, but it's important to understand how we get to this concept of delinquency and how do we approach it, how do we treat it. So cognitive theory is this specific branch of psychology that looks at, and this is where a little bit of philosophy comes in, perception of reality. So how we live in the world. So the idea here is that in regards to delinquency, we're looking at morality. And if you're unfamiliar with that word, we're talking about morals. And notice I put the right thing, but I put right in quotations. So morals and morality is just the societally accepted concept of what is right and what is wrong. And so the right thing may not necessarily be the right thing, but that is how we approach it. And so with cognitive theory, the idea is that as far as delinquency is concerned, that how we perceive morality, how we perceive things that are right or wrong, will have a clear impact on delinquency. So if we view crime in a positive nature, that the morals are a problem, then all of a sudden, well, we're glorifying it, which is a wonderful segue to focus on delinquency on pages 86 and 87. Ooh. But if you go there, at the top of the page is this little section that says violent TV, violent kids. And so, if you're unfamiliar with this discussion, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, this is going to be the discussion board question, or rather, it's going to be related to the discussion board question. There is a lot of studies that have been done looking at how exposure to violent media has had an impact on children. In particular, they tend to try to find connections between violent media and children being violent. This is where, there's often connections to school shooters and the violent video games or the violent shows and movies that they watched and the violent books they read. And it's like, there's a lot of research out there, but the data does not support it. And that's the problem, is that it's not a one-to-one comparison. It's not directly connected. And so in thinking about how cognitive theory looks at how the perception of reality, so I posed this what if. Hint, hint, it might be in the discussion board. So, like I said, this is not necessarily the exact question for the discussion board, but if we glorify thug life as the ideal, is a child who imitates it a delinquent? If we have rap songs and famous rappers who talk about the thug life, who talk about gang life and being a drug dealer and things like that, and they're seen as positive role models in the world, they are successful people, they do things, they get things done. And a child grows up seeing that as a role model and goes, yeah, I want to be that. According to cognitive theory, are they right? The perception of reality. The reality for them is, well, thug life is glorified. You want to have the thug life, but is it right? So, the answer to my question, yes, they're still a delinquent, but we have a bigger issue, and that's this glorifying. And so that'll be kind of the point of the discussion board, is to talk about this issue. But anyway, and how it relates to this. And I mean, like, to juvenile delinquency. Anyway, the one thing about psychology that I do want to talk about is just very, very, very briefly is personalities. So remember, I very briefly mentioned multiple personalities. So this is where I say I'm not talking about multiple personalities. That is a disorder. that does play into this, but personality and delinquency, we tend to identify particular types of personalities. One familiar one you might know is antisocial personality, which has also been called psychopathic and sociopathic. The long and the short is not a great term, but the basics of an antisocial personality is, as the name sounds, anti, avoid community, essentially. Yeah. And if you are avoiding communities, you're avoiding individuals that build some kind of friendship and camaraderie. Are you going to have a tendency to be potentially more delinquent? Yes. There is actually some connection between people who engage in delinquent behavior and the impact of a community. So, this one is equally problematic as we talked about with specific mental disorders. I don't like disorders either. So our textbook talks about intelligence, but I'm going to put forward another thing that needs to be talked about here. So if you're unfamiliar with what IQ actually stands for, things like that, it's the intelligence quotient. This is what we use to identify how intelligent you are, how knowledgeable. And I don't just mean like, oh, you can memorize facts. IQ is knowledgeable, it's critical thinking. This is just general smarts. But EQ is emotional. Empathetic. I would argue, even though our textbook does not mention it or puts it anywhere, at least not so far, I would argue that emotional quotient, the emotional level of an individual, would also play a role in delinquency. And I'm not sure how much data is available on this as the time of me saying it, but I am at least bringing forward that while there has been studies that have some kind of connection between intelligence, I'd argue that it's also biased in the similar way that mental health and other individuals tend to be on those outskirts who then engage in delinquent behavior. Same as emotionally unsound, emotionally imbalanced, non empathetic people, that kind of thing. But the other big thing, and I wanted to bring it up, and I told you I was going to come to it. The classic psychology debate of nature versus nurture. Another TDLR. Nature versus nurture is this big psychology debate that goes over what plays a bigger role in the development of an individual. Is it nature or is it nurture? For the longest time, it was two separate camps, one or the other. We now understand and accept more often than not that it's both. That an individual is a combination of their biological components and their environmental. So just because you were born to a criminal doesn't mean you're going to be a criminal. But if you are born to a criminal in a terrible environment that encourages criminal behavior, you have a higher likelihood of being a criminal. In the same way that just because you were born to a criminal, but you were in a better environment and a better situation where that is not the norm, doesn't mean you're going to be a criminal. Same can be said for if you grow up in a negative environment, but you have a non-criminal, very supportive situation, you can go either way. The idea here is that both nature and nurture have an impact in your potentialhood for delinquency. That's the big takeaway. So, if you notice in what we've talked about so far, in thinking about the larger discussion of, we are talking about choice theory or trait theory, just to go over what we've talked about so far. The two theories break down between the difference of freedom of choice and biology. Your choices that you choose to do things, and your traits, what you are made up of. And so we talked about deterrence and why it doesn't necessarily work. We talked about how trait theory says, well, the biology makes delinquents not totally accurate. There's potential for it, but it's not total. It has to do with the nature versus nurture thing, and also the biochemical makeup. But we also came down to, hey, the social factors, the biosocial theory looks at our biology, our psychology, and we didn't talk about the social. Hint, hint, that's what chapter 4 is all about, is the sociological issues with delinquency. And so that is what we are going to dive into in the next lecture video. I just wanted to do a quick wrap up of chapter 3 before we dove into chapter 4, which is going to look all at the social effects. And this is where we start to get into the nitty gritty of, quote unquote, what makes a delinquent, or rather the common beliefs behind what makes a delinquent. All right. That's what I got to say about this.